DJ and PK, it's 97.5 The Zone. We're joined now by Andy Bailey, NBA writer for Bleacher Report. Andy, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good.
I have a theory. You can tell me I'm right. You can tell me I'm wrong. You can tweak it. You can do whatever you want with it. I was discussing earlier this morning how March Madness is the best thing that ever happened to the NBA because we are at the point in the NBA season where the losing teams don't care and they want to lose. The winning teams are all winning by double digits. They're just beating the you-know-what out of these bad teams that don't care, that want better draft position. And when you do get two teams together, they aren't healthy. They don't have their full complement of guys. Now, sometimes it's load management, but it's also real injuries. I mean, Embiid is really injured, so Philly was shorthanded and lost last night. And Cleveland lost a close game. It was actually possibly the only really entertaining game of the night. Maybe there's one other. And Donovan Mitchell's out, and that injury's real. He needed surgery for, the fractured nasal, and then broke his face. Good grief. It's like you can't complain about some of these injuries. They're real. And other stuff is load management. So I just think it's a dreadful time of the year for the NBA. But we got March Madness, so I don't know that people really notice. But were you looking around the league last night going, that's a bad game, that's a bad game, that's a bad game?
Well, last night specifically, I kind of was. And even before the games started, I looked at the slate and thought, there's not a ton on here that's super compelling. I think there is a pretty nice natural progression from doldrums of the NBA season to March Madness, and then really right on the heels of that is the NBA playoffs. So it works pretty nice. The only thing I would say is I think since the addition of the play-in tournament, there's been a little bit more competitiveness in like the middle of each conference. There are a couple teams fighting for positioning around there. And then this season, there's a pretty interesting race for first in the West, too. But even those games have been marred by injuries. I mean, Denver just played Minnesota a couple nights ago, and Minnesota didn't have Gobert, Towns, or Reed, which is their top three big guys. So there's certainly something to your theory.
How much do you think teams really value being in the 5-6 slot as in staying out of the play-in tournament? Or are Dallas and Phoenix, for example, like, yeah, we're in the 7-8 spots. We'll be okay. It's not worth it. Or how much are they really going to dig to get to 6, get past Sacramento, and avoid the one-and-done scenarios?
I actually think it's pretty huge. And maybe I'm just reacting to fan accounts I see online, but it sure seems like their fans are interested in getting out of that play-in range. And there's obviously a huge advantage to being in the top half of the play-in, where you got to lose 2 games to be eliminated. So they're in a good spot as far as the play-in goes, but it's a lot better if you can just avoid that altogether. You're guaranteed a playoff spot. And this year specifically, I feel like certainly the Lakers have been overblown for much of this season, but they do have 2 top 10 to 15 guys. I wouldn't be stunned to see them win 2 games and get into the playoffs, and the same goes for the Warriors. In fact, I'd be a little bit more scared of the Warriors than the Lakers if I was one of those teams. If Curry and Thompson get hot for 2 games, all of a sudden they're in, and one of those 6-7 teams might be out. So I actually think it's very, very important to get into that top 6.
Maybe people were overreacting to the Lakers last year, who were in the play-in tournament,
right?
Escaped it, and then took down Memphis in 6 games, took down the Warriors in 6 games, and ended up in the conference final. Now, I don't think they were anywhere near winning the NBA title. They faced the champs, and the champs rolled them in 4 straight games. But nonetheless, it does put that thought out there that it doesn't really matter what you do in the regular season, just get in and then do what you do in the playoffs, and we'll find out how good you are.
Yeah, I do think there's something to that. There were multiple examples last year of teams potentially diminishing the value of the regular season because Miami was also a play-in team, and they made it all the way to the finals. So I think the NBA, they have some things to sort of grapple with over the next couple of years, and importance of regular season games remains one of them. I do think some of the stuff they've done has helped, at least marginally. Like I'm at this point fully on board with the play-in tournament. I think the adjustments that they made to officiating, I certainly would have been better to not do that in the middle of the season. But I think the product has been better since they did that. I think there's a couple other things they could iron out officiating wise. Like they're at least, I think, identifying problems and trying to do something about it. But it could be, it's going to be a process. I mean, the league is constantly evolving, and that's what's going on right now.
These lists comes out at the start of the year, and how many of the top 100 players do you have, and how many of the top 50 or 30 or 10 do you have to get to a conference final or to win an NBA title? And people constantly, look at those lists, and they can be a little squishy, but it does make for an interesting discussion. With the three guys you see that the Jazz have who are rookies that they got in the draft last year, can you project how many of those guys are top 100, top 50, top 25, top 10? Do you feel comfortable saying any of that, or are they just so young you would rather not us have tape of what you say right now to play back at you down the line?
You're talking about the 2023 class with Keontae George.
Exactly,
and
yes.
Taylor Hendricks. Okay.
And Sensabaugh.
Yeah, Sensabaugh was the other first-rounder. I think it's probably too early, especially for Hendricks and Sensabaugh. Really haven't been able to get a decent look at either of those guys until recently, and they start playing in this phase of the season that you described earlier, where it's hard to know what's real and what's not because rotations are constantly in flux. Those guys specifically have bounced back and forth from the G League. It's just kind of a weird evaluation period for them. I will say I hate to put a ceiling on anybody's ceiling or potential, and so I think they certainly could become like top 100 players. The guy that I would be most confident in, and I'm sure this won't surprise any of your listeners, is Keontae George, who's actually been really good the last month or so. From the moment I saw him in Summer League in Vegas, I thought, I like the way this guy shoots. I like the way this guy competes. I think he's been a solid playmaker here the last several weeks. And so he's somebody I could easily see developing into like fringe all-star, maybe even an all-star candidate. Like he's got a lot of potential.
And I'm not surprised that you said top 100 with him, and that's why I threw out the 50, 25, 10, because I think people expect that out of him, and if he's not top 100, it'll be a major disappointment. But to your point about fringe all-star, okay, is he a top 50 player? Is he a top 30, whatever? And, I mean, those things are really – they're fun to talk about, but, what is the difference on any given night between player 21 and player 32? I mean, some of that's just ridiculous to worry about. But nonetheless, it does kind of give you a ballpark as you look at teams and what they might be capable of, because the best players have such an outsized impact in this sport. I mean, it's just unbelievable how important it is to get one of those guys. Now, having made the air quotes, let's make them again, one of those guys. You have any feel for who's going to be available this summer? Because, yes, the Jazz could add 3 more rookies. They could. Maybe they will. They could combine 2 of the picks and trade up so they don't have to add 3 rookies and they get somebody they really value. But they could also use picks and players to go get veterans who might be available if you have any good feel for which teams might be blowing stuff up and making it available or worried about luxury tax and making somebody available.
Based on what we've seen from Danny Ainge since he took over, I would guess they continue to kind of slow play it in Utah, even though I think almost by happenstance this rebuild has gone a little bit faster than expected. I can't imagine many people thought Markkanen would be as good as he is. Kessler, I think, is better than people expected right out of the gate. But they do have the potential to get a lot of cap space. One player that's been interesting to me for them is Anunoby, but I can't imagine New York letting him go. Although they may not have a choice. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent. He's played so well there that it's hard to imagine him leaving. I actually just wrote sort of a free agency primer for Bleacher Report maybe a week or so back, and I mentioned maybe Klay Thompson for the Jazz if they want to speed things up even a little bit. He has declined a little bit, obviously, over the last couple of years, but he could be a nice veteran addition, championship experience to be around the young guys that wouldn't necessarily make them like a lock to make the playoffs. But if Golden State fizzles out and they think, well, we finally got a shake things up, there is value to just having like really good veterans around your young guys to kind of teach them, what it's like to be an NBA veteran, what it's like to prepare night in and night out. So long-winded way of saying I do think they'll probably just kind of keep going slow and steady with it, but there are options out there.
The funny thing about the whole expectations about how long the rebuild takes, and of course management never wants to, put a timeline out there because then they're held accountable to it. And I think that as much as we all grumble about it, if we were in their shoes, we'd do the exact same thing. But we're not in their shoes, so we get to grumble about it. But Ainge has done 1 and 2 year rebuilds in Boston, where they only missed the playoffs 1 year, they only missed the playoffs 2 years. So I think there's that expectation that it wasn't going to take long. At the same time, Oklahoma City seems to have slow played it, no veterans to speed it up. They got all these guys 25 years old and younger, somewhere between 21 and 25, and they're battling for the top spot in the West. And that's a 4-year rebuild. Well, if that's what your 4-year rebuild looks like, I get how 3 of those years suck. But, man, if that's where you are in year 4, maybe you just ought to just endure the pain and just roll with it, because that is awesome. Now, San Antonio, they got Wembanyama, but it looks like, well, that's at least a 5-year rebuild, and maybe it's going to be 6 or 7. We'll have to see when they, in the words of Dennis Lindsay years ago, push all their chips to the middle of the table and try to get a lot better. So I guess your thoughts on how long is it acceptable for a rebuild to be a rebuild?
I think the sweet spot is probably what you described with OKC, 3 or 4 years. And I think a big difference with Boston, OKC, and San Antonio is they got top 3 picks fairly early in the rebuild. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure Tatum and Brown were both in the top 3.
They were both number 3 picks.
Wembanyama was obviously number 1 overall. I think Chet was either 2 or 3. I can't remember
2
exactly where he was.
He was 2.
Jalen Williams was more of like a mid-first round guy, so that's more in the range of where Keontae George was taken. But it just helps to have a top 3 to 5 pick. NBA draft scouting has gotten really sophisticated. I don't feel like there's nearly as many misses in the top, 5 to 10 picks as there was when I was a kid. And so it helps to get one of those real high picks. Now, Utah, they have a different advantage with the draft, and then they get multiple bites at the apple seemingly every year for the next little bit. So there's maybe something to that too. But I think it certainly speeds it up if you can get at least one top 3 to 5 pick. That can make a big difference.
So to that point, are you surprised that the Jazz rebuild has gone the way it has and that they've held on to Conley and Clarkson and Olynyk as long as they have? I mean, obviously they moved some of those guys, haven't moved Clarkson, but I feel like those guys are the difference between, low to mid-20s and low to mid-30s in wins, which can move you, 5 or 6 spots in the draft, which, as you point out, then all of a sudden you don't have a shot at somebody at number 3 who's going to be all NBA and is going to be a top 10 player in the league.
Yeah, I think it surprises me maybe a little bit. I think there's a segment of Jazz fans that really don't like it. But I think it's kind of a weird balance because, again, I don't think that anybody expected Markkanen to be an all-star right off the bat. And I don't think – Colin Sexton, I think, has been way better than people expected this season. We were, putting people in certain tiers. There's an exercise I do with a bunch of the catch-all metrics that say he's been a top 40 player this season. And so, you could be an obvious, egregious tanker and just shut those guys down. I don't think you can trade those guys.
I agree.
Because it's not necessarily easy to get those players in the smaller markets like, a lot of the Northwest Division teams. So they kind of – again, by happenstance, almost put themselves in a more difficult situation than they expected to be in. So I don't necessarily think Utah did anything wrong, while also acknowledging, maybe it's better to completely bottom out like the process Sixers did.
And that was why I didn't mention the guys in their 20s who were outperforming expectations, because you're right. I totally believe they're hard to get, and to just give them up to rebuild, what are you doing? That was why I brought up the guys who are in their 30s, because there wasn't, they're known quantities, they're good players, they're going to help people win, and we've seen that, with Conley. I mean, obviously, Joe Ingles before that. Some of these guys, they know how to play and they're going to win. But also, they're not Colin Sexton. They're not that young and have that kind of potential upside. So, but they've chosen.
A good distinction. Yeah.
They've chosen the course they've chosen, and we will all wait it out. Hey, we appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much, and we will talk to you again, Andy.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Andy Bailey, NBA writer for Bleacher Report. Stephen Johnson, TCU beat writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. TCU, USU, 8 versus 9. Who's going to win? We'll talk with him at the top of the hour. Yak has concert tickets to give away. We will do that next. Stay with us.